Hi, everybody. Welcome to our talk today, this afternoon, and welcome to those who are joining us online. Just checking we're coming through all right. Yes, thanks. So for the last 10 days or so, we've had the privilege of hosting Professor Amanda Rodewald here at RMIT University in our Center for Urban Research and in the interdisciplinary conservation science group that we work in. Amanda is a colleague of ours on a ARC linkage grant project, which is investigating behavior change in supply chains, and specifically we've been looking at coffee as our case study. And obviously the sustainability of coffee is a key concern given its popularity around the world, and I'm sure many of us here and at home can attest to that, and maybe need to give a little more thought sometimes to where our everyday cuppa comes from and what its impacts on the planet might be. Yes, at the moment we're looking at different aspects of how do we shift coffee towards sustainability, looking at different indicators and codes and certifications that are being used in the industry, different ways of growing coffee and how those affect biodiversity in particular. And then our team has also done work on consumer preferences for biodiversity-friendly coffee and understanding how we adjust behaviors towards purchasing biodiversity-friendly coffee. And then we've got other research planned, hopefully to work with some producers, coffee growers, as well as the coffee retailers who are so prevalent all across Melbourne. But yeah, without further ado, let me introduce Amanda, and she is the Garvin Professor and Senior Director of the Center for Avian Population Studies at Cornell University. And this is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in particular. And Amanda had her PhD in ecology from Pennsylvania State University a few years ago now. And her interdisciplinary research investigates population, community, and landscape ecology with conservation biology and sustainability science. And at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, they also use community science and big data and computational modeling to try and understand and address conservation challenges in temperate and in tropical landscapes. Amanda was down in Colombia recently and so joined us from the rather warm tropics. And she's also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Ornithological Society, and has previously served on various boards and scientific advisory boards for the United States government. Her national leadership roles include serving on the Scientific Review Committee of the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center and the Nominating Committee. She's also presented at congressional briefings in the United States on legislative matters related to conservation and environmental protection. And so taking her work not only from the science, but influencing policy as well. And Dr. Rodewald aligns her research and outreach efforts in ways that support policy and management. And she regularly collaborates with and advises with a number of partners ranging from government agencies, NGOs, and the private sector. So we were really excited to hear further from you today, Amanda.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Dale, for that introduction, and thanks for turning out here today. I know it's before classes start, and thanks to those joining online. So before I forget, just a couple other nods. Yeah, that science, research policy link. It's been really fun visiting with folks here because, I mean, you guys really excel at that. I've been really impressed with what I've learned just over the course of my visit. And on the coffee side, I just want to plug too, like if you actually want to engage in drinking wildlife-friendly coffee, Victoria Zoos is selling some. They've developed some and have them on sale. I think online too, we were learning, but I'm sure you can contact Dale and others to find out more information about that. So, so today what I'm going to do is really, kind of through the lens of birds, try to see how, this one group of animals can actually help us to meet these larger goals we might have in terms of biodiversity conservation. And not to minimize the importance of birds in their own right, we've probably seen over the last few years, especially the last maybe 3, a lot of pretty alarming headlines about serious declines in the world bird populations. In the US, this has really hit home because we found that we've lost about 1/3 of our breeding bird populations. But most of what I'll be focusing on today is not so much birds bird conservation proper, but it's really how birds can help us to achieve, larger objectives that we have and address some of the global challenges that we're facing now. And this really struck home at the recent COP15 meeting in Montreal, where the 195 nations, not the US, ratified a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And there are a number of places in that where birds and the information that we have about birds can really help us to achieve some of those goals. So when we look at that biodiversity framework, there were three major goals: reducing threats to biodiversity. That's the one, and yeah, I'll just say too, there were 23 very specific targets under these three goals. So the first one, reducing threats to biodiversity, that's where the one we've heard a lot about, protecting 30% of the land and sea on Earth, and also restoring an additional 30%. There were a number of targets related to meeting people's needs and through sustainable use and benefit sharing. So this is kind of co-benefits, sustainable management, a lot of those topics that we're really familiar with, and also tools and solutions for mainstreaming biodiversity conservation in public and private sectors. That last one, it was really impressive, the business and finance presence at the COP15, something that, depending on one's perspective in the session, you might be rather cynical or very optimistic, how that can play out. But in all of these, we really can find that birds have an ability to help us to meet some of these targets in more strategic ways. And that's in part because we know that doing really the work that's required to progress toward these targets is going to require a lot of information to do it skillfully. So they're really data hungry in essence. And birds are nice because we know that, I guess I blocked out some of my animation consolidating here. So we know that birds can actually provide us with the information we need to develop, sound, evidence-based, and really cost-effective strategies. And so what I'm going to touch on today are some of the things that we can leverage when we approach these sort of through the lens of birds. I'm going to be talking a lot about some citizen science, data sources and applications, as well as radar, which I actually added after going to the Victoria Biodiversity Conference last week and just seeing all of the interest and activity that there is with artificial light at night. So we have some, really cool applications that are sort of fueled by birds there. And really with all three of these, they're really also leveraging the new advances in statistics and computational methods and partnerships that we are forming outside of academia, across government, NGOs, with private sector, and also engaging people. Engaging them both on the front end with collecting the data that we need, but also activating them to be really partners in conservation. To give a nod to bioacoustics, I want to recognize that in and of itself is an enormous area, tons to contribute. I'm not going to focus on that today because, I'm already pressed probably to keep within this one, 45-minute period. So just moving into really the citizen science portion, what we've learned over the last couple of decades in particular is just how much people are interested in being a part of science, right? And that's also part of the larger movement of really democratizing science, having us both engaged as generators and users of that information. And we can think about citizen scientists really as being, a global network of biodiversity sensors that are out there, interested and willing to engage. And there are lots of different sources of big data, in this. I know that, Australia, of course, is a big contributor to eBird and has their own portal with eBird Australia, but also BirdLife Australia has EBird Data, which has also been a really important contributor as I've read and understood with, on the ground conservation and legislation as well. And I also learned at the Victoria Biodiversity Conference of the Atlas of Living Australia, which just seems like an incredible tool for bringing together the variety of different data sets that are out there. So some of the examples that I'll be talking about today really are applicable and could be implemented using any of these and other data sources. I'm going to be focusing on eBird because that's the program that we run through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology with partners around the world. And so I'm most familiar with some of those examples. So just a little bit about eBird. Again, this is a program. There are volunteers around the world, and now we're starting to approach 1 million participants from every country on the earth. And we've consolidated, or we've brought together now over 1.3 billion observations. Australia, I'll note, is the fourth largest contributor globally. So you guys are really important to us as well. And so with eBird, unlike there are, some really impressive data sets like iNaturalist, but where eBird stands apart from some of those is our ability to really do rigorous science. And part of that is because of some quality control issues that we do with the eBird observations. In particular, we rely mostly on checklists. So you can imagine an observation is just you're walking along and it's like, oh, there's a lyrebird. I'm gonna submit that one observation. A checklist would be where you are submitting all of the birds that you've seen. So all are submitted. So that includes both presence and absence information. So that's much more powerful in terms of using them in any sort of analytic framework. There's lots of data quality review. When we go through the analysis, we're doing spatial subsampling. We're accounting for detection probabilities, not only with weather and time of day, but also even with the skill level of observers. You can actually quantify that by sort of how they're kind of like an accumulation curve, of what they're identifying relative to others in the area. So we bring that together with a lot of information, remotely sensed data on environmental factors, and then use a different variety of statistical and machine learning approaches to generate estimates of, let's see, I wonder why it's not, oh, there we go. Where we can generate really weekly estimates of relative abundance of species across the year. And so what's really distinct about eBird is both the fine spatial resolution, so 3 kilometers, the fine temporal resolution weekly, and the broad spatial extent. And it really allows us to see species sort of throughout the year. And we can do this for some species globally, like here for the barn swallow. We have the best data right now in the Western Hemisphere with migratory birds, but we do have quite a few from Australia now and Asia. Another element that I'll be talking about with eBird is we now have the ability to generate population trends. And so this has been a really big statistical advance because these are semi-structured data. So that's, tends to be more challenging to develop, trend information. But why this is really a game changer, and these were just released in November, is you can imagine usually, population trends, when we look at species, we're generating them at range-wide scales. And so this is an example for warbling vireo. This is a species that breeds across the US. So when you look at the range-wide estimates of warbling vireo populations, you look across and, well, it looks like good news. Blue, right? Populations are increasing. Probably what we'd say the status quo scale that we're using in most bird conservation efforts in the US is more regional. We have these bird conservation regions, and that's where, if you've heard of like the breeding bird survey that's used in the US by the government, this is the finest scale that we're typically able to estimate populations in. And I want to say too, I'm looking at broad programs, not like individual researchers who might have really good information at a particular site. And so when you look here, right, we kind of drill down a little bit in the spatial resolution, and suddenly you can see heterogeneity in those populations, right? So that's more information. We see that, well, you know, in fact, the vireo isn't increasing everywhere. It's declining in some areas. What we're now able to do with eBird is to generate those population estimates at 27 kilometer scale. And so the combination, again, of that fine spatial resolution, but the broad spatial extent is really a game changer, because here, both if we're trying to understand causes of declines, and if we're trying to really be more precise and strategic in where we're directing our conservation efforts, I mean, you can see that that's just a world of difference, right? And so we think in these ways, you know, these data resources that we're generating with eBird are really going to help us to do a much better job in detecting, diagnosing, and responding to population declines in species. So now I'll just kind of go through, and I have a variety of different examples. We'll just be kind of moving through quickly. So the first one, I just want to recognize that, of course, these resources are, you know, really important within the context of bird conservation specifically. You know, these eBird data, the bird data from BirdLife Australia, you know, all these can be used in population assessments and risk assessments. You know, and increasingly we're finding that governments are even willing to use these citizen science data, which is really significant, because for a long time there was a stigma against using them. So here there's an example with bald eagle. The Fish and Wildlife Service, during COVID, it was interesting. So COVID, during that time, during the pandemic, they weren't able to get out and conduct surveys on their own for like bald eagle, for waterfowl species, and suddenly that created a need to consider alternatives. And so we have projects where we were looking and comparing in hindsight, and also at the time to see how eBird data performed. And it turns out quite well. And so now we're able to actually use eBird data in terms of these formal government assessments. And it sounds like the same thing has been happening with bird data as well. One of the neat developments too is that we're able to use these big data resources in a way that we can streamline and really make more resource effective the permitting processes. You know, so a lot of, and I think this is an important context. So most of these examples that I'm giving, you know, the assumption is we can't do everything, you know, everything everywhere all the time, right? We are resource limited. Agencies are resource limited. NGOs, right? We have to make choices. You know, if we didn't have to make choices with where we spend our time, well, then we don't really need to be as strategic or you know, efficient. But that's just not the case. So, you know, here, if we think about bald eagles, you know, they're a protected species, you know, along with others in the U.S. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when they're giving out permits for wind energy development, they need to assess, you know, what the risk is. Which do they grant, which don't they? But they don't have time to invest the same amount of effort and level of scrutiny in every single project. And so what we've been able to do is to identify areas that are going to present higher risk and lower risk so that they can really, you know, make, I guess, align the level of oversight that they're giving with the level of threat. And so that's been, you know, one good development. But what I really want to focus more of my time on is really how we can use some of this information about birds to help us, you know, in a broader sense, you know, not really when we're talking only about bird conservation. How can we use this information to help us to optimize across different co-benefits? Right? We need to be more strategic in that way. We need to improve our return on investments. You know, so in other words, we're being pushed, you know, from every direction to do more with less, something that I'm sure everyone is very accustomed to in almost all forms of our efforts. And so one way we can do this, we think about that global biodiversity framework, right? We know that we need to have the 30%. We're trying to identify where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck when we start protecting, that 30%, trying to meet that goal. Well, these data, if we look at bird data, especially if we look across different taxonomic groups, or maybe if we look at different subsets of species that might really be good indicators of certain ecosystems or biomes, we can now identify across hemispheres for our migratory birds which sites are going to deliver the biggest benefit for populations across that full annual cycle, right? So not just thinking within the country. And so like within Australia, if you are really worried about certain breeding or non-breeding populations that are somewhere else for part of the year, we now have the ability where you can identify, where not only within the country you need to protect, but also where we need to look in other countries, where we might need to help and work with partners to protect important breeding or non-breeding habitats. And we can bring those data, that information, together with other data layers on co-benefits, right? So in the US, here, we might care about, well, where are sites where we want more, natural land to improve air quality or to protect pollinator populations, water quality, soil organic carbon, and we might have different, offsets where we know we need to also accommodate different activities, human activities, or to prioritize based on maybe, the threats that they'll face. Some areas are going to be much more likely to be developed than others. And this, I'm not sure if folks are aware of, there's a new development potential index that was published a few years back. It's global, that brings together sort of the suitability of different sectors. So agriculture, mining, fossil fuels, and renewable energy, and evaluates how, basically provides an index for how suitable that land is for development in those realms. So again, that's a way that you could look at it from the filter of either what areas might you want to avoid with conservation because we know we need to accommodate renewables, or which areas might be most threatened, because they're most suitable for those. You can bring in other layers on land value, to minimize costs. And of course, this is an area where, the prioritization where, Australian scholars really developed and introduced a lot of these methods. So you all brought this really, globally scaled up to the world with prioritizations, with tools like Marxan, and others. We now can bring this to really a different level as well, I think, with really trying to think on the front end much more strategically about where we're doing our work. And I like to think of this almost like precision conservation, right? And one example I'll just give you is with the sagebrush ecosystems in the Western US. So these are highly threatened systems. They're used for ranching, a lot of grazing, increasingly for renewable energy development. So they're under a lot of human pressure. And they're also, and they're also under threat from exotic grasses. So they've been being invaded heavily by cheatgrass, this Bromus tectorum. And this is a grass that basically displaces a lot of the native vegetation and also makes the system much more vulnerable to wildfires that can be and unnaturally devastating to the system. So one of the big restoration tools that's being used is to remove exotic grasses. But again, we can't do that everywhere all at once. So in this example, I just want to show how if we look at 4 different species of birds that are dependent, so they're obligate users of sagebrush habitat, how we can use information on population trends and abundance to really help us best direct our limited resources for those restoration efforts. And so here you're looking at a trend. These are the population trends. Again, the red shows where populations are declining, blue where they're increasing for all of these species. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. We're able to take information on those population trends along with land use, land cover data and identify what is the effect of exotic grasses on those populations. So here in this slide, we're looking at the population trends are estimated starting at 2007. That's why you're seeing 2007 here. So we look at the amount of exotic grass that's present in the landscape on the x-axis, the change that's happened over the period of our trend estimates, so from 2007 to 2019, and then we can look at the population trends. And so what we find, and this explains, we find exotic grasses explain about a third of the variation in population trends that we're seeing, so a decent amount. From that, what we learn is that for every 10% of exotic grass that's removed and converted to sagebrush habitat, that's about a 0.5% annual population trend change. And we can take that information and then create a spatial model where we can actually predict the population increase that we would expect from restoration. Again, each one of these cells is 27 kilometers. So it's still pretty big, but it's so much more refined, than if we were just thinking across bird conservation regions or state, or whole counties or something, and we're able to then, so if you had state agencies, NGOs, whatever partnership, if you're looking at where do we need to, again, where are we going to get the greatest return on investment for our restoration efforts, we have much better information to guide us. So again, this is a way we can really think about not only just the bird conservation, but really as we're restoring those ecosystems, where are we likely to do that? It's more than even just return on investment. One could also flip the lens a little bit and say, this is a way that allows us to better accommodate human activities that are going to be happening, that need to happen, that we rely upon one way or another. So again, it really helps us in that accommodating sort of social needs while also improving the effectiveness of our conservation efforts. One of the really interesting opportunities that we have when we have so much resolution on the temporal side of things, that weekly resolution, is that it's allowing us to really take very new, more innovative approaches to conservation. And we call this more dynamic conservation, where, you can think of the more traditional approach is, we decide, well, the most traditional is, here's a protected area. We're going to protect this from whatever activities in perpetuity, right? We might also have like land trusts, right? Conservation easements or covenants. I'm not sure what they're called here, where you might buy rights to development. But again, that tends to be more permanent and much more costly. But sometimes when we think about the conservation need, it might really only require activities being changed during one specific window of time during the year. And I think we can all think of this like conceptually, lots of examples, but having the data to actually identify in a rigorous, data-informed way when those windows are and where, that's been largely lacking. So like one example that I'm showing here is where we have, so it's mowing. So mowing of hayfields, right? So a big conflict that we have is grassland birds, which are really declining in the US. They're breeding during a particular time of the year that coincides with the most, with usually when the farmers are taking their first mowing, because you have the highest protein content, in the grasses. So there's this natural conflict. And so there have been some new programs that are starting to develop that will pay farmers for that loss if they will forego that first mowing, during, and so they have some loss, but they're compensated, and that allows these birds to get off that first clutch. But one of the issues is like, well, birds are going to be, the timing of their breeding is different in different locations, and how do you really do that in a rigorous way? And so this is where eBird data can help. Again, this need to accommodate human activities. I just want to, I guess, put a finer point on this, just with when we think about where birds are over the course of a year. This is taking together data from a variety of migratory songbirds. The yellow shows where the birds are spending the most time during the year over the course of the annual cycle. What we've learned is that migratory songbirds are spending the overwhelming bulk of their time in unprotected land, right? So over the course of the year, they're spending, over 80% of their time on unprotected land. So again, these dynamic approaches, and the ability to be precise is essential, right? We're just flat out not going to be able to meet their needs on protected land. And so just want to give a couple examples of how this might be used, this dynamic approach. So like one possibility here is like with military installations. So these are areas where they're going to be used for training and readiness exercises, but they're also mandated to protect all species. I had that picture, and now it just seems like these are all these unidentified objects that we're about to shoot down. Seems like every day. That's probably what we're going to hear tomorrow. It's like, I don't know, Peter and I have been talking. I don't know what's, but so with these different military installations, one can imagine that if we know which species are important from a conservation perspective, we can identify when during the year they're at that location, at any different military installation. And that really allows them, the Department of Defense can really say, okay, if we're looking across the board, how can we actually apportion these different activities to different installations or at different times of the year. So most of the use of the dynamic conservation is aspirational. We don't have a lot of examples, but I will share one that has been implemented really successfully. And this is out in California. And so here the central issue is that this is along the Pacific Flyway. So there are a lot of water birds, waterfowl, and shorebirds that move down through the Central Valley of California. A lot of the Central Valley is really valuable and productive agricultural land. In this particular area, it's used for rice fields, a lot of it. Buying the land, not going to be an option. Even easements on the land, not going to be an option. It's just way, way too costly. But the thing is that when you look at when the birds are using those habitats, it's really just during part of the year, a particular time. And so here you can see, like in January, February, and less so in March, that's when the migrants are really using those rice field habitats. And it happens that if we look at the rice field management, so when the birds are still using those areas, that's when typically a farmer would draw them down. They'd draw the water down and really effectively make them unsuitable. So this is an opportunity. So what we did is working with the Nature Conservancy and with California Audubon was to identify, okay, where are the birds? Where are the most important places on the landscape for these birds? Then work to identify, all right, with hydrological models, where do we think we're likely to have water on the landscape anyways, just based on, the forecast for the hydrology, because in the end, we don't want to pay to have water where we might have water anyway. So we want to focus our efforts on the areas that are most likely to be dry, other than for rice fields. And then we were able to come up with really a priority, a map where any piece of land, we could have a sort of importance value that was attached to it. And so what was really cool was that then they used that information to really guide a reverse auction approach where they advertise to the rice farmers, okay, we'd like you to keep water on your landscape for an additional 5 or 6 weeks during the year. How much do you need to be paid for us to do that? And so when they got those bids, they could take the bids and the amount farmers needed to be paid, sort of combine that with an estimated value of those lands, and having water on the land for migratory birds, and then allocate the money that they had, a fixed pot of money to implement that and to pay farmers in the most strategic way. And so what they were able to do is really save enormously. When they priced out the cost of this program was called bird returns. It was $1.5 million to implement versus if they were going to buy and restore land. I mean, it was astronomical. That wasn't going to happen. So an enormous savings. And it was effective. When we look at enrolled lands, which were in the orange, they did indeed support far more species and numbers of shorebirds and other water birds than unenrolled land. So this is the sort of thing that can really be a model. And again, it combines these kind of innovative approaches, but also they're data driven, right? These are data hungry approaches, and that's where they're made possible because of these citizen science data. There's also a lot of value in using birds as indicators, right? And this is nothing new, right? I mean, we heard the canary in the coal mine, and up in the Icon Lab, I saw, canaries, not coal mines, which I really like that little turn. But we have been using birds as indicators, for different ecosystem services, different taxonomic groups. And now, though, there's much more interest in using birds in this way by the private sector. We've probably, as you all have been hearing, there's so much more pressure and interest. So it's both kind of a push and pull in environmental, social, and governance responsibility, and the need to report that, not only to stakeholders, to consumers, but also from the perspective of finance. It was really amazing at COP15, the presence of finance, using that for how to direct finance as well in terms of risk and in terms of performance. And so this allows us, again, like on the front end, I know a lot of finance, they're thinking about what projects would we even support? And so an example of how this could be used, if we look in, this is in Northern South America. So we have Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. So they've had a big boom in mining concessions. And so they've been granting them, without really much regard for biodiversity value. But with these big data resources, we're able to then bring together, information on maybe the proposed mining concessions, how do they align with important bird areas, for migratory birds or for resident species, and really identify, on the front end, where projects are likely to have really substantial impacts to biodiversity and maybe shouldn't be funded, or financed. So, and I think it's at least what the conversation was at COP15 really showed too, it's not just the private sector isn't solely motivated from the sort of compliance perspective, but I think there is now a growing recognition that really their operations depend upon a healthy environment. This was a survey that was done by the World Economic Forum, where they were asking business leaders to identify what they saw as the greatest risks to their company in the next 10 years. The green ones are environmental. So those top ones, climate action, failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss. That's what they're seeing as the greatest risks. So there's more appetite now than ever to really engage in conservation from the from the private sector. And I think one great example, Dale had mentioned the project that we're working on here together with an ARC linkage grant focused on coffee. Coffee is just this great example because it really, if you think about biodiversity friendly coffee, the social needs, the environmental needs, the consumer preferences for good coffee, everything really starts coming together. And so we do find that a lot of companies are really starting to think about their impacts and their management and keeping shade on farms really for their own benefit. So we have a project now with Nespresso and Ecom, which is a big distributor, where they are, really incorporating more shade trees on coffee farms, not only because they care about their responsibility and biodiversity, but also because they care about good quality coffee. And rising temperatures mean poor quality coffee in many cases, at least in many parts of the world for Arabica coffee. And so we can use now these large data sets like eBird to really develop indices that help us to monitor, sort of progress. And I'm just going to kind of skip through some of this, but basically it's using not only environmental variables, but also species relationships, right? And interactions among species with new methods developed in collaboration with computer scientists on, so joint species distribution modeling. And what we can do is look at community completeness, right? Because we know different places are going to vary in terms of how much they're or how close they are to what they should have in terms of species richness. And this allows us a way to really compare apples to oranges. And so not only can we, I see the time, so I apologize. I'm going to go a little bit faster over these. So not only can we look at how individual farms perform, so relative to how they're supporting species of conservation concern or just overall species, we can evaluate them that way. We can also start looking at how coffee landscapes, so down here at the bottom, compare to even other types of sort of land protection. So here the government of Costa Rica, where we've been working, is really interested to know, well, how is the performance of protected areas, in different kinds of protected area status, their biological corridors. They have a pretty sophisticated program for payments for ecosystem services. And it really lets them see which different management approaches are actually resulting in the outcomes that they want for biodiversity, and for conservation writ large. So we think this is something where now we're scaling up to Central America, throughout Central America, and hope to do into North America next year as well. So this last part that I kind of plugged in, so sorry, I rushed, but I thought just again, given the interest in sort of artificial lights, I thought you might be keen to hear about this, is really looking at how technological advances are helping us to use big data sets that we've never really deployed previously in a conservation context. And so, we long know that, birds, there has been an attention on birds because we know they're, encountering a lot of different hazards during flight and during migration, right? And so that's what really inspired thinking about, this sort of project. And we know that weather radar can detect biomass. Well, it can detect anything in the air, right? And so, and that includes birds. So we have, for a lot of places, right, like in the US now, we have a whole system of these NexRad weather radar stations. And so those are collecting information on, every single day. So what we're able to do, there have been new approaches where you can now take this information, you can remove the weather pieces, right? So the precipitation is in the green and yellow and red. And once that's removed, we can actually identify then the sort of biomass and the bird biomass. So here what you're looking at, each one of these circles is basically at night when birds are lifting off from night to start their migration. And so it provides us a measure of where you have this intense activity. And with that, we're able to take, so we have years, 20 years of next weather information. We can look at those. We can analyze them to identify associations with movements of birds and the weather. And so what that does is it allows us, anytime we have a weather forecast, we can then use those associations to help us generate a migration forecast. And so we get these sorts of things. And so what this is looking for, this is just a 2-night window, looking at the predicted movement of birds in that area. So, I mean, that's cool just to look at, and neat. And it's great for science and understanding the science of migration. But from a very practical standpoint, this just gives us a lot of information that we can use to help address some of the negative effects of artificial light at night. Right? And I know there are a lot of researchers that are focusing on this, Ray in Victoria, based on the Biodiversity Conference, and that was probably just a small fraction. And so what we've done at the lab is we've developed, I just want to show this. It's really, birds are attracted to light, artificial light at night. Okay, and so if they're attracted to that light, then they're more likely to collide and die with buildings. So that's the link here. And so this is just showing this is at 9/11, the tribute of light in New York City. And so we've done work. So one of the big concerns with these big lights was like, really, are you serious? I mean, all these buildings, those dots moving, those are birds. And so, we've worked from one conservation standpoint is where, we have spotters out there, and when you get too many birds accumulating, they can turn the lights off briefly, and then the birds can disperse. And they've shown too, the effects are pretty amazing. This is showing at 10:12 when there aren't any lights, the density of birds versus just 20 minutes later after the lights are on, and then they go back down. So it's significant, how much lights can make a difference. And so what we're doing now is we're issuing these alerts. So we have a social network, through social media, we can make predictions over the next 3 days about the movement of birds and where, what we would expect based on the weather forecast. And then we can issue these alerts that let people know, hey, tonight's a lights out night. So for individuals, they can turn off their lights. But we also are finding that that's really compelling for cities as well. And we're finding now that a lot of cities, this has convinced them to have these lights out programs that they're doing. And they're able to, in some cases where there are concerns or different needs based on light, they can time those programs, for the most important times of the year, or just have them during the entire migration period. So it's really been, the adoption and the enthusiasm has been really impressive. And like always, the sort of theme of, we need to be strategic and where we focus our efforts to really get the biggest bang for our buck. And so here again, we can take those forecasts over the entire course of a season, combine them with what we know about the light exposure in any given area and come up with an exposure index that we can use to actually compare cities. So in the US, we know now, where are the deadliest cities for birds in the spring and the fall, right? And so this is something that, again, helps us to be more effective in how we're really focusing our efforts. And also a lot more convincing for the cities, right? And there are other uses now too that are pretty interesting. So like if we think of the avian flu, well, right now we're getting a lot of interest from poultry farmers when they want to know big migration nights, want to bring those animals in and reduce exposure. That, collisions like air flight collisions, that's a big concern. So once again, there it can really give an alert. Wind farm, wind sighting, so all of these areas, all of these different uses are extensions of that new technology, or I guess the new application of a technology of weather radar. In Australia, I mean, you have actually pretty good coverage in terms of the weather radar. And it sounds like I couldn't find just with my Googling. I know there has been some research and attention that's been done with like looking at flying foxes and being able to predict movements there, but it seems like, and someone else actually at the end, if someone knows if it's being used in the lights out sort of capacity, I'd love to hear that. But there's a lot of opportunity to really expand these applications, particularly in these urban areas. So again, sort of a fast and furious sort of overview of just how we're able to now leverage, new technology, engagement of citizens, partnerships, in ways, and new computational approaches, in ways that we can use birds as sort of an agent of change, as a way to engage people, as a way to develop innovative solutions, be more precise in our conservation efforts, where we can accommodate, human activities, where we can get greater returns on our investments, and really help to, meet these new targets that we're establishing in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So with that, thanks again for everyone who's turned up. Appreciate that. And thanks very much to my hosts. I've had a wonderful time visiting here. It's been great. And just in hearing too, like at the Victoria Biodiversity Conference, it was really impressive, to just get a sampling of all the great research that's happening here. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. Yeah, that was a really, really interesting talk. It's incredible. We know in the information age that humanity is accumulating data and information at unprecedented scales, but I think what's so exciting is when we take that information and we apply it in these novel and interesting ways to help solve some of our most pressing challenges. And yeah, I'm sure that our colleagues at BirdLife Australia and our partners at the Victoria Biodiversity Atlas are already using all of their data in solving similar kinds of problems. Yeah, do we have any questions from anybody in the audience? Or perhaps from anyone at home? I have one here.
Thanks so much for that talk. Really, really interesting. And I have a question about the weather monitoring stations and how they, firstly, how do they actually capture when birds are doing their major migrations, like from that area? Is it with just ongoing video surveillance? And then also in Australia, do they do that from weather stations?
Right. So the part 2 will be a question for the audience, right? And but yeah, so for the first one, so this is just like the weather forecasts you get, just the constant weather radar. That's the information that they're using, right? And so it is continuous, and we actually have information going back, in the US like 20 years. And that's what we've been able to draw upon to make those associations. But yeah, anytime you get now a weather forecast, that information can be used now because we've learned those associations to estimate what the expected migration will be, and to do that in that sort of spatially explicit way. And so again, it's where it's more on the conservation side, it really has been a computational advancement. And that's sort of that I do not do that, but they're able to really extract those birds. We're also able to, now we're just developing the ability to combine it with eBird data, because we know what's on the ground then, within that week or over days, and we can start seeing then to predict what the species are, in the air column, so to have some inference about that, that's another new thing. So I'm curious, does anyone know about then the use in Holly? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know your theory, if you don't mind.
I don't have anything specific to say than to say, yes, it is the same technology is being used in Australia. I was trying to Google a couple of examples, but I have no internet connection in here, so I can't explicitly tell you which ones. But yeah, it's really cool. So the radar scatter signal that we get from a biological artifact is a different type of signal to the radar scatter you get from, say, a cloud that is holding rainwater, and so that's how you're able to filter the data. And because these species are migrating en masse, it creates this incredible signal. I think the radars are sometimes so sensitive they can even capture just a few individuals.
Right. And
what's really cool is you can do that with invertebrates as well. So you can actually capture some of the mass invertebrate migration that's happening.
Like dragonflies, right?
Yeah,
Are a big one. Yeah, so I had been Googling too, and so they're in the conversation. So that one thing I put up, that was in 2019. And it was a student up at Charles Darwin University who had used radar to study flying foxes. And she was making kind of a pitch like, hey, we need to be doing this with birds here. So my guess is 2019, it wasn't being done, but 3 years. So maybe, maybe it is now, but I couldn't find anything concrete online either. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose not to belabor this any. Thanks for the wonderful talk. Yeah. But I'm just curious if you have any insight how it actually differentiates the biomass between the invertebrates and the birds, considering there's some sensitivity tolerance or something like that. Do you know anything?
I think there's that, and because you're using different cross sections as well, which I think is where you get estimates on some of the biomass. I think there are also a lot of temporal differences in when you're getting that. So dragonflies and a lot of the invertebrates are migrating during the day, whereas most, overwhelmingly most of the birds are migrating at night. So I think part of it is that, understanding the biology of what to expect, aloft at different times. So that's part of it. Adrian Doctor is the scientist who's been really working in this field with us as well. And so for the much more technical aspects, I could connect you to him. But I think too, there's now the EU is starting to look into implementing this, Colombia as well. So it seems like there's a lot of promise.
Thanks, Amanda. That was great. And just, some of the stuff that you showed at the start with what you can do with the EBird data, it's really quite striking. And I'm just wondering, do you have a sense of whether or not, what kind of global coverage could you get? Is there enough data in enough parts of the world to be making those same inferences that you can make for the Americas in other parts of the world? And I know we had some really interesting conversations yesterday about how you might try and incentivize data collection in some of the other areas. Just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. So we do have that information probably in Europe, and some places along the Asian, Australia, corridor. We have Australia and at least the more, in the eastern parts, where the population is now, there are sufficient data to make a lot of, probably similar projects. What I think is the limit now. So we have, the data generation, but there's an enormous amount of work and so money as well in terms of using those data to create what we call our status and trends products. And so there, I think that's where building out other sort of collaborations, or having other teams and scientists who learn, can actually use those techniques because we have, a team of different computational scientists and statisticians that are working all the time, building those models, improving those models, to generate really what are the more usable products. So I think part of it in some parts of the world, again, like in Europe and also in Australia, there's sufficient data, but just not maybe, we at the lab don't have sufficient human resources to do them ourselves. So I think there is that opportunity. In terms of data gaps, yeah, that's a big challenge. And so we've been working with, like we were discussing yesterday, computer scientists to really develop these sort of smart gamification sort of approaches where like birders, are a little bit crazy, it's like they get really into like competition and listing and, if they're seeing their name, up on a sort of scoreboard for how many observations they're contributing, there's a reward system that's already kind of built into that. But what we've done is we've, tested out in New York, and there's also in the US and the Southwest, the Sonoran Desert joint venture is actually using this, where they assign different kind of points to locations that if someone, based on how hard they are to get at or how much the data are needed there, how much of a data gap they are. And so then for a participant, if they go to that particular site, they'll and submit a checklist, then they get some points. And so, that's can be, again, like where they are on a ledger can be the reward, or we use like the number of points as like, well, here are the number of entries that you'll get, to get to win a pair of like Zeiss binoculars, so that sort of thing. And what's cool about that with the computer scientists is that it's an algorithm that changes, right? Because as more people go to certain places, obviously, then the next most important place to go is going to change. And so, yeah, that's really where we're trying to figure out those innovative ways to fill those data gaps. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, just quickly, and following on from what you just said, I imagine, so there's sort of two parts. One, there's probably some sort of bias or something if you're doing a competition, like do you worry about sort of false reporting? And then secondly, how is that sort of stuff, the uncertainty, is that built into a lot of this data, and how does that come through, especially when we're making management decisions from the data?
So we do have a series of a network of reviewers, so of eBird reviewers. So automatically, because bird watchers tend to have a good idea of like what would be an unusual sighting. So that automatically is flagging observations that require additional documentation. So that's a major piece of it. And that's and so one of the issues we actually have in that, it's not so much that methodological way of catching, those maybe false or those observations, but it's also it's hard to find a lot of reviewers sometimes because that's, so in some places that might be the issue. We also, in our status and trends models, are only using checklists from participants that have reached a certain level of competence. So we kind of use something like almost like a species accumulation curve, right? Where you can compare them with other birders. And again, it's not a punitive, I want to be clear, it's not like any sort of punitive way, and we're not looking at individuals and we don't give that information out, right? It's just sort of behind a more anonymous screen. We don't want bird watchers to think they're being like judged. They're not, right? But there is that way to really, to help ensure data quality. And sorry, the second question, I just lost track of that. It was
only if we have time, just about how that uncertainty propagates into, like, if you're using it for management decisions, the data, that's.
Yeah, and so there again, error propagation is always a big issue, and not being, this is getting more in the weeds of the statistical and computational methods. So to be honest, I can't answer that level of detail on the statistical parts, but we have, we have a lot of people who are using, different, machine learning and other AI approaches and we have, so, well, I'll just leave it at that because I would just be throwing out words. Yeah.
A bit more of a, I guess, a broader question, but striking the different strategies you put up for the Costa Rica and the different types of conservation strategies and how they benefited species richness, I believe was the metric. And your protected areas was one of those that performed poorly relative to the rest. And so if we've got this 20 by 30 target, 30 by 30. 30% protect area by 2030. What are your thoughts? Well, one is eBird contributing to potentially the prioritization of protected areas? And two, what is your thought around that target? Is that an appropriate target to have? Is it something that's, I guess a great communication strategy, but not necessarily the best conservation strategy?
Right. So just to be clear, so the metric we're using gets away from species richness, because I think what you're alluding to, species richness is really a lousy target, really, right? Because we know we can increase species richness by bringing in exotics or generalists, right? We start fragmenting habitat, and so that's so what we're doing is actually looking at performance based on community completeness, right? And so that's where I think it's a much better target, because it allows us to really compare the performance of different systems that might be species rich, where they should be, like some tropical forests, or like a lot of protected areas, in the US, for example, it's like rock and ice wilderness, and just areas that may not have, or even some old growth systems may not actually be that species rich naturally, but you can actually look at how they're performing in that sense. So I think community completeness is a much more ecologically meaningful and legitimate measure. If you were going to use species, that would be a much more appropriate measure than species richness per se. And so I think that's really the value of that. And I mean, overall with the target, as we know, we have so many different, there are so many different needs, right? It's not just about species. We have different ecosystem services that we need to maintain. We have enormous social inequities where we need to be really aware of that, and people's access to using different resources. So like any policy decision, well, the science and some of these metrics are but one piece of that puzzle. But I think that, I guess the broader that point is the information and the tools that we have today allow us a way to much more, effectively and I guess skillfully, really include that information, rather than making assumptions that might be unfounded. And in some cases, it might be that some human uses or access to certain resources, are going to be more important in a given instance than would be maximizing community completeness, right? But now we have that information to mindfully make those trade-offs, right? All these decisions are trade-offs, right? And so, but if we don't have the information really to gauge where we are as we're trying to evaluate those, well, we don't really know how well we're doing. So I don't know if that skirts it or addresses it, but yeah.
Is there a willingness, just a follow-up question, is there a willingness by the US government to use these tools to prioritize protected area development, or?
Well, that's interesting. So our 30 by 30, right, in the US, they're very much, well, the US didn't ratify, first of all, the 2020, the framework. So take that for one, overall, but for the 30 by 30, in talking with like the Council for Environmental Quality at the White House, is really managing this. They're very, very much into the idea that the decisions should be made locally and by communities. So they are not keen on any sort of top down, here is where thou shalt protect. We don't even know what counts as conserved, right? Because it's not really protect there, it's like conserved. There's disagreement on that. But once again, like here, I think it would be, so if you have communities that are making the decisions on how they want to, what conservation measures they want to implement and where, here's a way that in the bigger picture, they can maybe see how their parcels or their conservation lands are going to fit into the larger framework. And so where I think it could come in handy, again, not as a prescription, but maybe for funding, like, I mean, if you're a land trust and you want to, you know, get some easements in a particular area and you can demonstrate the significance of those sites, you know, for, you know, these international targets, well, you're going to be in a much stronger position for getting funding, whether it's from donors, whether it's from businesses, whether it's from government grants. So I think that's where sometimes these prioritization methods, you know, and optimization, you know, too, where that comes into the fold, right? It's like, I think we've all learned that top-down prescriptive conservation, I mean, as much as that is like an attractive idea in a lot of senses, right? It's just, it's not going to work. It doesn't play out well. It doesn't honor people's different needs and rights and, you know, sovereignty to the land. But it is a way that they can use that to help advance their own objectives too, I would say. But I know we're over time too, so I don't want to hold people hostage. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. If you have any other points, be around, come down, have a conversation. But yeah, thanks again, Amanda. It was a really wonderful talk. And being one of those crazy birders myself, I can attest to how much fun it is going to collect data and subject to these lists. First in the South African Bird Atlas, sometimes eBird, and now Victoria in the Bird Atlas project. So get out there. There's lots of different platforms that you can contribute citizen science data. If you happen to be more interested in butterflies or dragonflies or trees, probably an app for you. And then you can be a part of this global team of biodiversity sensing. So yeah, thanks very much. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much.